I'm here today. I'm Susan Haupt. I'm the Geoenvironmental Section Manager. At least now I'm the Geoenvironmental Section Manager, soon to be the Hydroenvironmental Manager for headquarters in Salem, and maybe someday just the lowly Environmental Manager. We'll see how the organization continues to change. And Jim Collins is with me today, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
I'm Jim Collins. I'm the Geo-Hydro-Environmental Manager down in Region 3, down in Roseburg.
So I first met Jim when I interviewed for my first job at ODOT in 2000 for the cattle trot interview.
I was in high school in 2000.
You were not. Oh my gosh. I feel so old. So we're here to talk to you about the environmental division, or the environmental business line at ODOT. And I did that introduction to make you aware that we are not an isolated business line. None of us really are. But environmental is really a culture that is spread out all across all of our business lines. And our environmental staff are here to support you in exercising our responsibility to be good stewards. We're not here to dictate that to you. And other things that we are not is, at least we try to show up at work not this way. Some of us might be this way outside of work in the environmental field. But we are not tree-hugging flower children at work. We are not eco-cops out to get you, tattletale on you. We are not alarmists telling you the sky is going to fall if you don't do things this way or that way. We are really just here to support you in your business lines. And one pet peeve that I think a lot of the staff in environmental have is when we get called at work environmentalists. Although we might be that in our free time, at work we're environmental staff supporting ODOT's environmental ethics and responsibilities. So, like I said, we are here to support you and partner with you and to help support compliance with all business lines and in regions and in districts, to help you avoid and minimize and mitigate for impacts that we sometimes have to incur, to help you obtain permits and approvals from the whole plethora of environmental regulatory agencies we have to wade our way through, and doing that as efficiently as we can. We're here to help with streamlining, to get us away from that project by project, mother may I, and put systems into place so we can move swiftly through projects with what we call programmatic agreements. We are here to support relationships with our regulatory partners at the highest level, all the way up to the directors. For example, I sit every 2 weeks on the Natural Resource Cabinet in the governor's office with all the directors from the other natural resource agencies throughout the state. And that's my opportunity to weigh in on how some of the new regulations might affect ODOT's business line. And we're here to educate you and keep us out of hot water. So, does anybody have any idea of the kinds of disciplines that we work with within environmental? A lot of people come in and have this really simplified version of environmental. What kinds of disciplines do you think are within our business line? Just shout them out. You don't have to raise your hand. NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, that's right. Those are the ones where we have to prepare environmental assessments sometimes, environmental impact statements sometimes for our really complex projects, but about 99% of our projects are covered under what we call categorical exclusions these days anyway, and so we can go pretty swiftly through those projects. Anything else? Any other disciplines you think we cover? Air and noise, that's exactly right. And we have our Region 1 noise coordinator here today, Daniel, who deals a lot with noise ordinances. We deal a lot with noise walls and assessing noise of a project, things like that. What else? And air, of course, air quality, Section 404. I don't even know what section it is. Clean Air Act stuff. History, that's right, historic resources, which are different from archaeological resources and tribal resources. What else? Wetlands, that's right. Okay, so you guys are pretty much nailing it. We have archaeology and our relationships with our tribes, which we manage. We have historic resources, which are usually built, both aquatic and terrestrial biology, wetlands, water quality, stormwater runoff, erosion and sediment control, which is particularly important in construction, of course, roadside development. So we have, I think, 3 or 4 landscape architects throughout the state that do this sort of work. We do noise, National Environmental Policy Act, which is always called NEPA, permits and compensatory mitigation, and air quality. Just a note that the greenhouse gas and climate change, that work is done largely out of the planning division at ODOT, not so much out of our shop. And if you have questions, just raise your hand as we go. We don't need to wait till the end if people don't want to, if you have a question. For statewide managers for environmental, we essentially have 6 managers with a deep academic or work background in environmental. And Jim is probably one of our longest standing ones. And Jim is somebody that we all go to in headquarters and the other regions when we have one of those head scratcher questions. He's sort of on everybody's board of advisors. But there's myself, John Rash, and Rod Thompson. We're in headquarters in Salem. And then out in regions, we have Dennis Reich, who's a new environmental manager up in Region 1, who came to us from the Freshwater Trust. We're really excited to have Dennis on. Bill Warnicki, who's now the Region 2 environmental manager, who used to be the fish passage coordinator in headquarters. So he's one that's been with ODOT for a long time as well. And then, of course, Jim Collins. Russ Frost in Region 4, who oversees I don't think he oversees hydro, right? Just geo and environmental. But Russ has been in our section for a long time and knows his way around a lot of environmental issues. Stephanie Anderson in Region 5 is the tech center manager, but she's our go-to for both geology, hydrology, and hydraulic engineering, and for environmental. And Stephanie's been a really fast learner, just wonderful to work with. But these are your go-tos on the management level out in your regions. I know you've heard a lot from the various business lines on the difference between headquarters in Salem and the region offices, and we're very much in alignment with that. So generally speaking, in headquarters, so in Salem, in my shop, we're dealing with manuals, standards of practice, consistency, training, statewide meetings, engagement from your staff on ensuring that we are getting products and tools that you need, so we are answering the mail. We also are helping putting together statewide price agreements if we're going to start to see those more as our outsourcing goes up. So we can take on those large statewide RFPs for various services. Also, Jim's, in fact, just took a little hiatus just for a few minutes to come and talk to us today, and he's right now working on an initiative to revamp QA/QC for environmental, which is being done right now in a lot of different business lines. We're also responsible for data systems, tracking, compliance reporting to federal highways, and a whole list of other things. But generally, we're your backbone. We're getting you the tools, the training, the standards of practice, the manuals you need to be running smoothly, and your environmental staff need to support you. And the region folks are out there on the ground with their boots on the ground, helping to deliver projects. And I think I was so shocked because I always think we're like the ones with the most manuals, but then when I heard, I guess it was Doug Bish or somebody had 30 manuals just for traffic, I was like, oh, I guess we're not alone. I always thought we had the most, but we do have a whole pile of manuals. And these manuals are largely used by the environmental staff in your regions or consultants that support us. But it's just good to know that they are out there. They're all in various levels of disrepair and currentness. And some of them haven't even been developed yet. For example, we're just getting our wetlands manual off the ground now. Key environmental regulations. So there are a lot of environmental regulations that we have to deal with. And I think it's fair to say that the cadre of environmental staff at ODOT are probably the most diverse, deep environmental group for all state agencies. We're not the Department of Fish and Wildlife just focused on fish. We're not DSL, Department of State Lands, just focused on wetlands. We're not Department of Environmental Quality, just focused on water quality and air quality. We're not just SHPO dealing with historic and archaeological resources. Our staff deal with all of it. And it's very complex, the way it all has to fit together. Avoiding an impact to one resource could mean an additional impact to another resource. So our environmental specialists are having to look very holistically at landscapes. And because of that, I think we have a really special body of staff within the state. From the typical practitioner, engineer, project leader, area manager, whatever role you play out in the regions, the important thing isn't to memorize all these crazy environmental laws. It's a maze to get through. And your region environmental coordinators, which we refer to as RECs, know this maze really well, and they're the ones who are going to help you navigate through it. So build those relationships with your region environmental coordinators. Get close to them. But just remember, these are the important things: air, water, noise, fish and plants and wildlife, cultural resources, so historic resources, and cultural resources from the perspective of archaeological resources. And do remember that when we work with our tribes, for the tribes, natural resources and archaeological resources are all part of their culture and heritage that they depend on to sustain that culture. And so just be aware that when you're working with tribes, it's just not all about bones and old village sites. It's also about our natural resources that are critical for their way of life. I'm not going to go through all these regulations because it's just a crazy list, but just be aware that they're out there. Did I miss anything major? Oh, parks. This is one that's sometimes overlooked. We also have really special regulations around what happens when we impact parks. And those are hard bars to get under. So just be aware that when you're out there designing and you run into a park, especially if it has any federal funds in it, we have to jump through some hoops to be able to have those impacts. And usually we have to do some compensatory mitigation. Am I missing anything major? Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Jen.
Okay.
Let's talk more about from the project delivery standpoint.
So you guys probably in the last day and a half of it's information overload, I imagine. So if I were to ask you to recite all the regulations that Susan just went over, do you think you could do that? No, probably not. I couldn't even do it. And so as she mentioned, it's really important that as you work through projects that you get to know your REC. Have any questions, go to the REC, because they're the ones that know all those different processes. They're involved with project development from scoping all the way through construction and really into maintenance. So as far as project development, you saw the racetrack with the milestones. Environmental deliverables don't match up with those milestones. There's various statutory timelines with each clearance that really, it's project dependent. And so the REC is really responsible for making sure that we deliver all the necessary clearances that a project might need to go to PS&E. So one of the critical points is in DAP, even pre-DAP. When we first kick off a project, some of you guys, especially in roadway, the REC will be going and trying to establish a footprint. The reason why they're trying to establish a footprint is because they're trying to see what sort of resources are out there that we might impact, and as a result of that, what sort of clearances are we going to need? So they'll be working really closely with especially the roadway designers to establish that. From that, they'll create an area of a potential impact. And as I just mentioned, that in that area, what sort of resources do we have? Associated with that is, once they know what sort of resources and what sort of clearances we might have, right at kickoff, they're already starting to map how long is it going to take us to get those clearances? What information am I going to need, or is the environmental staff going to need to start creating those permit applications so we can get them submitted and get those clearances back in time for the project to be delivered. So that really starts right at project kickoff. They'll be coordinating with roadway, bridge, really all the disciplines on that project team. As we go through project development, though, frequently there's changes, and so they're constantly checking in with the project team to see what sort of changes are there and how's that going to potentially affect our permits. Did we think, you know what, we're going to avoid that wetland? Now all of a sudden, oops, we're going to hit that wetland, so that's going to add some time on. We're going to have to apply for a permit. And so they're constantly checking in to make sure if there's any changes. So as you're working through, if you're a roadway designer or bridge designer, wherever your area is, if you're working through your design and you have a change, when in doubt, just pick up the phone and call the REC. Hey, my slope's going to go out a little bit further. Is that going to be an issue? So their job, the REC's job, is to be the liaison between the project team and all of those environmental specialists that are required to deliver a project. It's not your job to know the details of all the regulations and how long it's going to take to get a permit. So kind of tying on to what Susan said earlier, some of the things that they're looking at when they're creating that area of potential impact, they'll create a map that is actually tied to what we call a Part 3. And it'll have things on there like wetlands and streams, parks, cultural resources, different ESA species. Hazmat is also included in environmental. Environmental justice populations is like low income or minorities. Stormwater, bridge span length that's tied with fish passage, detour routes, staging, those types of things will be on that map. Depending on the region and the REC and who, how they create those maps, frequently they'll tie into our drafters saying, hey, here, can you put this map together? Here's what I need on it. And so they work really closely with the roadway design staff and drafters in creating those API maps. Again, we don't expect you guys to know how long it's going to take to get these clearances. That's the REC's job, working with the specialists. But right from the kickoff, when a PL sends out a schedule and says, hey, how's the schedule look? What they're doing is they're looking at saying, okay, here's all the clearances I'm going to need. Here's how long it's going to take to get them. So I'm going to need these types of information from roadway or bridge. So yeah, that'll work, or no, we need a little bit more time. And the things they're considering are what sort of NEPA classification it is. We don't have too many EAs and EISs, but those take a lot longer as opposed to the class 2s that are 90% of what we do. 4F, 6F, all those things you see in that list are all things that they consider when looking at the project schedule, seeing if can we deliver those environmental clearances within the proposed schedule. Likewise, as you're going through and you realize, you know what, we have a change, all of a sudden, you know, now we're going to replace that culvert and we weren't originally. Those are all things that we have to go back, or environmental has to go back and look, hey, are we still going to meet those timelines? So take those types of things into consideration as you're working through project development and you're working on your designs as to, we ran into a change. When in doubt, call the REC. Once project development concludes and we put that project out to bid and it goes to construction, the RECs are still working really closely with our construction staff. Because one, there could be project changes that could trigger permits, or we have a in-water work window that we're tied to that we can actually be within the stream channel working. Sometimes we need to get a variance to go outside that. And so they work really closely with our construction staff to do that, as well as we have certain monitoring requirements associated with our permits that we have to do during construction. Sediment erosion control is an example. So our RECs work really closely with our construction staff as well. Migratory Bird Treaty Act is another one that we run into a lot, and that's actually just been, I would say, within the last 10 years. Long story short, it has to do with nesting birds. We can't go in and disturb nests. Well, we have a permit, we can in some cases, but so we try to get out in advance and clear any trees and brush so that we don't have to deal with that in construction, because it can delay construction months, if not a year or more, because of nesting birds. So really, again, what we want to emphasize is we don't expect you guys to know all the environmental regulations. We don't expect you to know, hey, do I need to talk to a biologist or a wetland specialist? The take-home message is, again, know who your REC is and just stay in contact with them throughout the entire project delivery life cycle. Sometimes there's a tendency to want to really tighten down our project limits. In some cases, the environmental wants to expand that a little bit, because if we consider just outside that area and we happen to have a change in scope or something happens, we've already got that covered. And so at times, the environmental want to look at a little bigger area than what the project is. But it's just a bridge replacement. It's just right here. Well, you know what? You have a detour bridge, or you might need a disposal area or something. So they tend to look at a little bigger area, and that's why. Again, keep your recs in the loop. You should be in constant communication with them, because really, they're not here to cause us problems. They're here to really help us get our job done as quickly and easily as possible and still satisfy all the environmental regulations that we got to deal with. Again, recs are your friends. When I first started at ODOT, it wasn't as long as what she said.
In high school.
One of my first meetings was in a maintenance shop, and I used to work at ODFW, and walked in, sat down, and I got called I won't say what the first part of what he said, environmentalist. And I was like, oh no, what did I get myself into? Since that time, the culture really has changed, and the recs are here to help. I mean, all the environmental staff are here to help. So really look at them as partners through project development, because that's their primary role. So for the various regions, here's a list of the recs. In Region 3, we actually have a third one. And in addition to Sam and Jerry, we have Doug Sharp. And again, I can't emphasize enough, know who your recs are, give them a call.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Well, I just wanted to add one thing that I sort of forgot to touch on. I mentioned programmatic agreements earlier, and Jim mentioned it too. We do have programmatic agreements for the Endangered Species Act. We have a programmatic agreement for Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. We have a programmatic agreement kind of for take of birds. It's a special permit we have, the only one in the nation actually, where we're allowed to take inadvertent take of a certain amount of birds without being in violation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is very unique. And actually our Endangered Species Act programmatic agreement is touted as the best in the country as well. But all of these programmatic agreements, the regulatory agencies are looking to us to be good stewards with respect to the commitments we make in order to be basically self-regulating and not have to go to the National Marine Fisheries and U.S. Fish and Wildlife every time we're doing a project that might affect endangered species. And so it's really important your recs know what those programmatic permit conditions are, and it's really important that we comply with them. We recently had a couple of compliance issues that almost cost us our ESA, our Endangered Species Act programmatic agreement. We had some violations, multiple ones on the same projects. That agreement alone saves project timelines from a consultation for endangered species that used to take, 6 to 9 months, sometimes longer, down to days, usually days. So it's really important that when you're operating under a programmatic agreement that we're very respectful about the commitments we have made with our regulatory agencies when they're trusting us to self-regulate and do what we promised on those projects. That's the only thing I'd really wanted to emphasize. So I guess with that, we'll take questions.
Questions?
Yeah. There's one other. I gotcha.
When you talk about those violations, can you give like a little more detail? Is this something that's being overlooked in design or construction, or?
The most recent one we've struggled with a little bit, and I won't go into the details or call out specific projects, is related to management of water quality and containment during construction, so that we're assured that we don't have any sort of materials, sediment entering streams that are the environment for fragile species, or that could alter, like concrete could alter the pH in a system or something like that. So those would be examples of a few missteps we've had recently that really, I got a letter from Federal Highways kind of giving us a warning, like, this isn't okay. It's really the federal, because we're operating under federal highways, they're the ones with the relationship with the other federal agencies, and they are trusting us to stand by our word, because it's really their agreement with the other federal, U.S. Fish and Wildlife and NIPS, which are federal agencies. That's a federal to federal relationship. So those are some examples.
And violations, I mean, hear that, it sounds pretty harsh, and it is, but they vary. Anything from a sediment fence that's maybe up off the ground a little bit, which, you know what, let's fix it. And we move on and we're done. And we see that quite a bit. Or out on a construction site, fuel can that's not in an area that's contained. Again, I mean, there's no harm done, but it could if something were to happen, and so fix it and move on. All the way up to where we've had fish kills that have cost us a lot of money and respect with the regulatory agencies over the years. Fortunately, those are far and few between, but when you hear violation, there's a full spectrum there. And so as far as project development, I would say, to really condense it down, is our environmental staff, we shouldn't be putting restrictions on project development to where we're building something that is not realistic, that's going to cause us problems. So really working closely, I mean, we might have a regulatory agency that say, we want you to build a 300-foot wide bridge here. Yeah, that's not realistic because of these reasons, but we can do something else. So we shouldn't be building stuff that's unrealistic that's going to cause us problems.
Yeah. You had a question. Back in the green shirt.
Could you elaborate a little bit on what historic resources are, just for the good of the order?
Historic resources would be any built resource that would be eligible or is listed and in the national, I don't know, Alex, what would I call it? The National Historic, the what? The National Register of Historic Places. There you go, National Register of Historic Places. Okay, you're talking, are you Haley? Yeah. Okay. You should be answering your own question, but I get what you're doing. Right, so those are built historic infrastructure in our built environment, environment. So sometimes they're eligible, they're not actually listed, and sometimes they're actually listed. And we bend over backwards to avoid impacts to those because they are troublesome once we have to incur impact. So we always go along that avoid, minimize, and then our last resort is we're going to impact and we're going to do compensatory mitigation. And for historic resources, that compensatory mitigation is often comprised of documentation. Really clear documentation of a structure before we dismantle it so that we have it in the record.
Along those lines, you heard us mention API, Area of Potential Impact. Historical will have what was called an APE, Area of Potential Effect. And that's different because that's looking at particularly the effects on a historical resource. So don't get those confused, the API as opposed to the APE.
Right. Any other questions? You guys have caught on to the fact that, oh yes.
What triggers like an EIS as opposed to an EA?
Well, you know, EAs are kind of a gray area, fuzzy ground. So the question was, what triggers an environmental impact statement under NEPA, which is the highest, most laborious, process-driven environmental sort of document you could have to produce, as opposed to just an environmental assessment, as opposed to a categorical exclusion maybe. But I will say that what triggers an EIS technically under NEPA is a major federal action that significantly affects the human environment. Keep in mind, human environment includes the natural environment. And if you don't think that you're dependent on it, I don't know what planet you're living on, but it's part of your environment, the bugs and the trees and the bees and everything else. And so when we have a significant federal action that will adversely affect the human environment, then that triggers an EIS. With federal highways, highly political controversial projects can also trigger an EIS. And that's just to ensure that a really robust public process is put in place to vet those projects. So sometimes with transportation projects, an EIS is triggered by political hot buttons and controversy. That's unusual and a little bit specific to DOTs. There might be some other military actions that are subject to that sort of scrutiny too, but usually it's a major federal action significantly adversing the human environment.
In that, on those projects, that determination is made before project initiation. It's made. We know that's coming before project's ever kicked off. Typically, we know that it's a major intersection that we're putting in. Okay, yeah, that's going to be an EIS. We usually don't get partway through project development and go, we need an EIS.
Yeah.
We know that well in advance.
Right. And right now, I think we have maybe 2 or 3 EISs running in the whole state. And they're in kind of early stages, like Rose Quarter is probably one of those. Or maybe that's even an EA, I can't remember. It's amazing what we used to cover under EISs and EAs that we're now covering with categorical exclusions. You were going to chime in and say, Rose, something about Rose Quarter?
No,
Oh, it's an EA.
Right now, but there's controversy,
Yeah, I mean, sometimes things get reclassified or they get bumped up or bumped down. But what you'll hear the environmental people say is, has the project been classified yet? And that means has it a class 1, class 2, or class 3? And that's EAs, EISs, or categorical exclusions, not in that order. I'm not going to relate it all. It's too complicated. Any last questions? Because I think I'm really close to being out of time. Yeah?
Yeah, I was wondering,
Microphone.
who manages the wetland mitigation sites as far as, is it from the regional level or the districts, or
That's a good
is
question.
it, or are they stewards?
So there's different.
Yeah, there's
different
different-
types. So
Okay.
wetlands mitigation, we have what we call the postage stamp that's right on the project, as if it's a bridge project, and you're hitting a little wetland and you're doing some enhancements right there.
It's on-site in kind.
On site, so the wetland specialist typically monitors and tracks that, all the way up to our big mitigation banks.
Which are in my shop.
And so those, in some case, up until a point, ODOT manages those. And then we have tried to, once we get to a certain point, basically give money to like the Nature Conservancy, because we're not in the business to maintain wetlands long term. So we try to get other entities on board to manage those long term. A real short answer to your question.
Yeah. I mean, there's always an appropriate place and time for a region-specific wetland specialist to look at in-place, in-kind compensatory mitigation for that particular project, because that's the most prudent thing to do. There are also times when we're doing the postage stamp approach just to check a box, and it's really not the best return on investment. And we are working diligently right now, and it's going to be a long road, towards a place where we can get ODOT out of the compensatory mitigation business altogether. We should be firmly in the business of avoiding impacts, minimizing impacts, and when it comes to compensatory mitigation for impacts we can't avoid, we're trying to get to a place where we're just doing payment and lose. So we're just paying, say, like right now we have this fantasy, we're going to pay Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, and they're going to take care of all of our mitigation needs in this kind of multi-dimensional ecosystem sort of way, and we just run a credit system, and that'll keep projects running smoothly too. Like, get ODOT. We shouldn't be in the business of compensatory mitigation. Those should be much bigger thinking ecosystem people that are tied in with all kinds of other partners that can help us fund things. Are we out of time?
We have about 2 minutes, maybe even less. Short question? Short question time.
Yeah.
Going back to the question about EISs versus EAs, can you give a couple of examples of projects that people would recognize where we ended up in the EIS category?
Oh gosh,
So
can't think of any recent ones.
I can give you Region 3 examples, but I don't think two of you are from Region 3. They typically, like in Region 3, our big one was Highway 62 detour, or not detour, but realignment. So we put a brand new stretch of Highway 62 in. That was an EIS. South Medford Interchange. Kubler Interchange was one.
Oh yeah.
Woodburn, I believe, is another one. Wasn't Woodburn an
I don't
EA
remember, that
or
was
EIS?
when I was on my hiatus, but
So they typically tend to be either new alignments or a new interchange or a drastic revamp of an interchange.
where you're going to basically be doing a lot of earth work in an area that has not previously been within ODOT's right-of-way. And we're doing fewer and fewer of those projects, and FHWA is being much more flexible with what they can cover under categorical exclusion and an EA.
Newburgh to Dundee, that's one.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's right, Newburgh, Dundee.
Yep.
So I think, like I said, when I first started in 2000, just in Region 4 and 5, I was running maybe 8 EAs, maybe 1 EIS, and now I don't think they've had any out there for years. I mean, outside of North Bend Parkway. So,
Those projects tend to be in the tens of millions, if not
Yeah.
hundreds of millions of dollars, and so obviously we don't deliver too many of those mega projects. So.
yeah. Anyway, thanks for your attention,
Great.
everyone.
Thank
I know
you,
it's tough on day
Susan
2.
and Jim.
Really
Thank you so
appreciate it.
much.
Thank you.